A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, well actually November 8th, 2012 in Espoo, Finland, Rovio released their biggest collaboration yet, Angry Birds Star Wars. Combining two of the most beloved franchises in recent memory had a predictable outcome. The game was downloaded over 100 million times, spawned tons of marketable merchandise, and had fans clamoring for a sequel almost immediately. As the first game retold the events of the original Star Wars trilogy, it's only fitting that an Angry Birds Star Wars 2 would cover the prequel trilogy. Our first hint of this highly anticipated title was delivered on July 11, 2013, which left little ambiguity as to what was to come. 4 days later, the announcement trailer blasted across the interweb, giving fans a glimpse of what Star Wars 2 had to offer, as well as a launch date, September 19, 2013. The main gameplay trailer would drop the week of, highlighting two brand new core gameplay mechanics that would differentiate Star Wars 2 from its predecessors. For one, you could now choose your allegiance, whether for the bird side or for the heavily marketed pork side, with level packs evenly distributed between them. This would allow for greater level diversity, more effective storytelling, and a better variety of gameplay. The biggest selling point, however, was the playable character roster, not only featuring all your favorites from Star Wars 1, but nearly all the heroes and villains from the prequels. In total, there are over 56 different characters spread across the factions, each one with a special ability. Rovio leveraged this roster to the fullest with their second brand new mechanic, the telepods, a feature which would carry over to other Angry Birds games in the years to come. The Angry Birds franchise at its peak benefited from the revenue streams of both the games and the merchandising. And while they certainly complement each other, the merchandise itself rarely had a direct impact on the gameplay. Rovio's new partnership with Hasbro was set to change that, resulting in a range of products aimed to integrate the toys directly into the game. For Star Wars 1, Hasbro released playsets and figurine packs that allowed fans to recreate levels from the game in real life. They essentially did the same shtick for Star Wars 2, but this time the figurines were the primary selling point. This line was called telepods, allowing you to use the characters you collected in any level you like. Each character had a small QR code which had to be paired to a functioning camera. Each product came with a clear magnified base that allowed the app to read the bottom of the figure. And just like magic, the character you selected would replace the character in your slingshot, opening up a whole new world of strategies. To me, this was always the main selling point of this game, as it put all of the iconic characters in the spotlight. Sure, the environments and level designs are brilliant as always, but when we reminisce about Star Wars 2's brilliance, the characters really made the experience. They obviously knew this too, because they had DK publish a fully fledged character encyclopedia, media that I highly recommend. And as I mentioned, each character has a unique ability and leveling system, meaning achieving total destruction involved precise mental calculations. Star Wars 2 demanded perfection to receive 3 stars, with most levels requiring you to use 1 or at most 2 shots to do so. Trial and error as always will keep you occupied for hours on end. Just remember that choice isn't always a good thing. The best levels were always saved for last, as boss battles returned from the first game, this time with Henry Cervalli's unforgettable Angry Birds-ified take on Duel of Fates playing in the background. In terms of sheer content, Star Wars 2 was light years ahead of the original, though personal preference for the episodes captured certainly has swayed perception. But that's enough of the game itself. I can go on all day heaping praise on Star Wars 2, but I've got a feeling I know why you're here. Here you are because, like me, you love these characters so much that the mere idea of a plush line gets your bird brain racing. These little collectible figures from Hasbro were great and all, but they never really served as a proper replacement for a plush counterpart. There were 2 waves of characters for the first game, which sold in numbers that met expectations, so why not introduce even more characters to the market? The Angry Birds and Star Wars franchises alone are big enough pop culture icons to warrant such a thing. There would presumably be collectors of both who would gobble up every last one. But, just like Qui-Gon's misguided faith, so was ours. No such wave would ever materialize. Waves 1 and 2 would continue to line store shelves through Star Wars 2's life cycle. Allow me to bestow upon you the history and eventual fate of Commonwealth's cancelled Star Wars 2 set. I would like to begin our story where most of us became aware of the supposed Star Wars 2 set. Toy Fair 2014, specifically the New York Toy Fair. At the time, the trade show was held in mid-February at the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center in Manhattan, and typically showcased the latest Angry Birds merchandise from some of the most iconic Rovio licensees. The highlight in that department year after year was the hometown Commonwealth toy and novelty, the first company to ever acquire the Angry Birds license back in July of 2010. They, of course, are responsible for the majority of Angry Bird plushies sold around the globe, and Toy Fair was their annual opportunity to put their projected lineup on display for those in attendance. Don't get the wrong impression though, this event is not open to the public. Since those in the industry and select guests can partake, documentation is typically limited to a photo or two, if you're lucky. Rarely do you ever get complete coverage, but in this particular circumstance, somebody had our backs. Enter our old friend Sir Steve's Guide, the go-to Star Wars news outlet at the time. If there's Star Wars about, you best bet they have somebody on the spot to provide some sort of coverage. Angry Birds was no exception. The news would fall upon deaf ears, however, going completely unnoticed by the majority of the community until this infamous Angry Birds Nest article showcased the guide's photos a few months later. Their claim was by no means outlandish. New Angry Birds Star Wars plush toys are coming to a store near you. Consensus was overall positive, with most excited to add the set to their collection. But as the months went by, people began to wonder when they'd show up in stores, if at all. Year after year, the reality slowly became apparent that the set was, well, canceled. It's not like Rovio or Commonwealth had to provide an explanation for this, and as you'd expect, they never did. If this was a main series game, you best believe the entire community would be up in arms. Merchandise, on the other hand, well, it just doesn't carry the same cachet. So we'd be stuck theorizing for the ensuing decade, with little to go off aside from Sir Steve's Guide's original photos from Toy Fair. Oh, and the few eBay sellers who somehow acquired samples, because that happened. From the mere glimpse we saw though, this undoubtedly would have been amongst Commonwealth's finest sets, certainly as it relates to the intricate character patterns. Not to mention the sheer number of characters it was set to include, would have easily been their biggest assortment ever. Rovio presumably lost the Star Wars license around 2015 as Star Wars 2 received its last content update at the end of 2014. But that wouldn't have inhibited the set's release, as it clearly was meant to debut in 2014, not after. Wouldn't it be such a great move to put them on the market over a year after the game itself launched? Frankly, they kind of already missed the boat, as the set should have debuted alongside Hasbro's Telepod line in the lead up to the game. And for my viewers across the Atlantic, you're probably well aware that Tesco stores held a promotion in 2015 where collectible stamps could redeem any one of 9 Commonwealth Star Wars plushies. Interestingly, for that massive production run, Commonwealth reused the art that was supposed to don the tags and boxes of the infamous Star Wars 2 set. Why did that happen, and does it have anything to do with the mystery at hand? Most importantly of all, are the plushies still out there? These eBay listings would indicate the affirmative, but with many characters still unaccounted for, there's always going to be doubt. Let's assume they are. The most logical people who would be in possession of such items would be Rovio and Commonwealth, of course. Naturally, the billion-dollar game developer had their fair share of social media accounts that occasionally provided an inside look as to what happened behind closed doors. Commonwealth, on the other hand, while certainly a legitimate toy company, cannot exactly garner the same following. They're just the name on the back of the tag for most, forever overshadowed by the big licensed brand plastered on the front. While their socials provide excellent insights, for the purposes of this exercise, Rovio seems to have the droids we're looking for. For instance, if we take a look back at their Inside Rovio YouTube series, specifically the one regarding brand licensing, we got our one and only look at their seemingly expansive merchandise archive. Blink and you'll miss it, but right here there was a cluster of Star Wars merchandise, and among them rests the Royal Guard. The same character, albeit an earlier design, can be found perched on a shelf in a Family Gamer TV interview. And as recently as 2020, 3 more unreleased Star Wars plushies were spotted inside a cabinet in Rovio's foosball table room. Emperor Palpatine himself, alongside what appeared to be a Death Star and an R2-D2. Their identities were confirmed by fellow plush enthusiast General Cryptor, who traveled to the land of Suomi to investigate and document the trio. Commonwealth, meanwhile, not as much to go off. The Hong Kong showroom and WikiBear videos that I highlighted in my Go documentary are the closest we'll get to anything from them. Just a couple of blurry background shots of a few of the characters, but nothing that would indicate that they still have them. If only one person from either side of the story could come forward and put all the rumors to bed. Provide finality for what has always been the holy grail of lost Angry Birds merchandise, if not the franchise as a whole. And I think I know just the guy. The gang's all here. Every single character, including some we would have never even known to exist, still united in an excellent condition. There are a staggering 39 of these, way more than the 17 shown at Toy Fair. Now, this isn't necessarily because there's an additional 22 distinct characters, not to say there aren't any, but the inflated number comes from the fact that the majority have at least 2 variations. When creating a plush toy, the first design is never the final design. There's always something to correct, whether it's an element that would cost too much to put into production, or a detail that doesn't meet the standards of the licensor. And there's a handful of other reasons, but regardless, these are the plushies Commonwealth chose to archive. It's highly probable that even earlier variants exist, or rather did exist at some point. But sadly, given that this information is over 10 years after the fact, that information is no longer within anybody's recollection. Anyways, let's finally give these the showcase they've always deserved. I'll go over each character one by one, point out a few of their interesting details, and provide a bit of history should they have multiple variants. Let's start with the birdside characters, beginning with Slave Princess Leia. Now, you might be confused as to why she's even a part of this set. If you haven't noticed, there's a couple of characters here that most associate with the original trilogy, not the prequels. Allow me a quick tangent, because I feel this is crucial to your understanding of this set. It's never explicitly stated anywhere that these are indeed based on Star Wars 2 exclusively. Granted, most of the hang tags are in the Star Wars 2 style, but that logo is sans the Roman numerals. Hasbro's merchandise was like this too, which allowed them to integrate themes from Star Wars 1 into their lineup. Heck, the game itself allowed you to use various characters from Star Wars 1 in Star Wars 2 as telepods. What I'm trying to say is this: ignore the tags. Half of these reused the generic Star Wars 1 tags anyways, giving credence to the idea that this was simply meant to be an additional assortment of Star Wars characters, regardless of which game they were featured in. Development on these began as far back as December of 2012, around the time Rovio themselves began developing Star Wars 2 itself. Enough of my tangent though, back to Leia. Of course, the specific Leia was never a playable character, only appearing in the Moon of Endor cutscenes. The plush itself has, in my opinion, the ideal Stella face. It's perfectly neutral, unlike the other samples and production variants we've looked at in the past. It's nearly identical to the regular Princess Leia plush, but she's looking straight ahead on this one. Another upgrade can be found around back, where you discover she was given proper tail feathers, at least compared to the original, with its pretty lackluster 3 generic tail feathers seen across multiple other Star Wars plushies. Her head feathers are tucked below her braided hair, which was translated brilliantly to the plush. The bra embroidery appears to be more accurate to the movie than the game, but the design is still there, essentially making her production ready. This is simply one of the best in the set in my estimation, but not exactly age appropriate as you can imagine. At least, I don't think so. Lando Calrissian, or hashtag LandoBird as he was introduced, is another character from Star Wars 1, specifically from the Cloud City update. He has 2 variations, one with blue robes and one with the corrected purple robes that we know from Toy Fair. Not sure which I prefer, but I have to give Commonwealth credit for nailing both. He's got this yellow accented collar stitched to the body, an element shared by both variations, ignoring the main color of course. For further comparison, the first variant's mustache hairs protrude from his beak, not behind like on the later version, which is actually more accurate to the official render. But this comes at the cost of the suit lacking some detail and his hair being far too bushy. The second variation got some extra detailing below the V-neck as well as a receded hairline, once again an improvement in terms of accuracy. This was Commonwealth's second attempt to give an Angry Bird a smile, which was accomplished using some simple black stitches on a white surface between the upper and lower beak. This beautifully captured that signature grin that he has in the games. A cocky but distinct expression for sure. The last birdseye character to originate from Star Wars 1 is the Ewok, or Wicket if you believe they were attempting to capture that specific Ewok. This is another character that has two variations where the differences are quite subtle. Well, besides the giant slingshot on the back of the first sample, a detail only seen in the cutscenes of Moon of Endor and the aforementioned character encyclopedia. For the later variant, it was removed along with the rock sash below the cloak. So that makes the original superior, right? Well, once again, it's kind of a give and take, because in the later one, the stitches became embroidered both on top and on the side. The belt color also changed to a lighter shade of brown to match said stitches and contrast with the cloak element more naturally. The cloak itself appears to be ever so slightly lighter as well and fits the body tighter than the original. And looking past the outfit, you'll find that the eye embroidery was adjusted to better match the innocent look of the official renders. Qui-Gon is the first character we play as in Star Wars 2, and once again I am impressed by how well Commonwealth captured the character. He has a rather unique design, almost eagle-esque you might say, with that large curved beak and those white feathers. The mustache and goatee are an embroidered detail even present below the beak, although it is difficult to see. Most of his hair is just a short-cut brown-colored velvet fabric surrounding the white, but transitions to this thick felt for the flowing hair. The same materials are used for his Jedi robes and tunic. He even has a lightsaber hilt, the same one used for the original Luke and Obi-Wan plushies. The later variant looks pretty much identical, same determined facial expression, same lightsaber, and the same general pattern for the hair and tunic. However, they changed the robes to match the thicker composition and darker brown of the velvet tied back hair. From mentor to student, the young yet wise Obi-Wan is up next, and this is the first instance where I firmly believe the first variant is superior. The two differ quite significantly, evidently because of their facial expressions, right? He gives off this almost smug demeanor, like he's judging whoever dares be in his presence. This closely matches his idle render before you fire him using the slingshot, as well as most promotional artwork of the character. To me, this is the more familiar look. He wears a beige tunic with a brown belt and a lightsaber near his pocket. Unlike the Ewoks we looked at earlier, almost the whole belt is an embroidered detail, aside from the white buckle, which is a sewn-on piece of felt. His facial hair features several different embroidered colors and is actually asymmetrical to account for lighting differences, though it doesn't extend down to crest his robes. To be fair, that detail doesn't appear on every single render, but I would still appreciate the extra detail. Obi-Wan also dons his exotic hairstyle that curves along the edges and sweeps back at the center. The polyester fabric here is amongst the longest cut I've seen on a Commonwealth, but works excellently for Obi-Wan's hairdo. If I had to nitpick, it's perhaps too reddish brown and doesn't curve downwards as much as it should. The underside, interestingly, is just a short-cut light brown Balboa. Move down to the eyebrows and you'll see that they're a medium red color, notably a different shade than the hair, a distinction present in the game as well. His left brow is slightly higher than the right, but maybe that should have been a centimeter or two higher to really nail the look. Enough of this one though, how does it compare to the one we all know from Toy Fair? Well, the later variant for sure captured the hair better. It's longer, has sharper curves, and seems to feature the accurate number of edges, 8 as opposed to 6. I do prefer the center sweep on the first variant, though it's still present on this one, just a bit less exaggerated. Moving down to the facial expression, where you find a more traditional angry look. From what I can tell, they base this one off the in-flight render, but don't believe this is the look most of us associate with the character, and the bluish-gray embroidery around the eyes isn't quite right to me either. On top of that, the facial hair was a significant downgrade. Not even because it lacks the color palette of the original, but more so because it doesn't match the exact brown used for the hair. Focusing on the suit, it's practically identical except for two things. The belt buckle added these black stitching details, but I failed to see what exactly they were referencing. It's not there in the game, that's for sure. The other detail is the embroidered pocket, which moved from his left to his right side. It's hard for me to say which is definitively correct, given that it shifts back and forth between the renders as well. I can see cases for both sides. Then we run into the infamous Naboo Senator Jar Jar Binks, a goofy looking fella, but as the encyclopedia puts it, he's no yoke. Nor is his plush, it's brilliant. Jar Jar's distinctive features are seemingly endless, from his duck-like bucktooth beak around front to his floppy, scaled ears dangling around back. Then there's these eye sockets that just jut out from his body like a crab, but somehow as an Angry Bird, it all adds up to a pretty adorable character. Not much was changed from version 1 to 2, but it feels like a definitive upgrade. Jar Jar's ears are described to be scaly by the encyclopedia, a detail made more profound in the later one. There are some minor color changes of course, subtly for his clothing, but more noticeably for his eyelashes. To me, this is the only area where I prefer the first version, and it's a significant difference that almost makes me partial to it as a whole. Only thing stopping me from doing so is version 2's eye sockets that now match the main body of the plush. Then how's this one for a surprise? One of the glaring omissions from Toy Fair, it's Pod Racer Anakin. And you've likely immediately fixated on the paper details, so allow me to explain. As you'll see with a good number of these samples, they do not rely heavily upon prints, usually opting for embroidered details, which are preferred anyways, right? This particular sample was so early on in development that I presume they wanted to see what the character would look like with those regions as prints. If they didn't like how it turned out, they would go back and work on a pattern that integrated those markings into the embroidery. The helmet itself is made of that polyurethane foam used on many Star Wars plushies with some felt accents for the goggles in the front. His beige robes are only present on the front side of the plush, but look spot on despite their simplicity. In that face, it almost looks like he's sad he never made it to Toy Fair with his mates. Would call it more innocent than sad though, given the intended characterization of young Annie. I'd like to know how the cocky, eyebrow-raised expression would look on this guy, but this is pretty great too. He's got the typical 3 tail feathers around back, where you'll also find the sparingly used Commonwealth sample tag. Turn the tag around and you'll find that it has a few lines for some basic information about the plush. And it might surprise you to learn he is actually dated for May 8th, 2013. Given that there was nearly a year between his inception and Toy Fair, it's almost hard to imagine they hadn't finalized him by then. Almost as if he was cut due to potential production costs. A shame, but thanks to my relationship with Commonwealth, he will forever be documented and preserved. If I had to crown a weak link in this set, that distinction would go to Captain Panaka. That isn't to say the plush is bad, in fact when you cross-compare it to the game, it holds up fairly well. The usage of polyurethane foam as opposed to felt or Velboa was an interesting decision, though it's thin enough to not look too bulky on him. This one certainly would have benefited from a darker color palette pretty much everywhere, almost looking as if they cranked up the saturation too much. You also may notice he lacks any sort of sideburns that are plainly visible in all of his renders. Don't imagine that's a detail that would be terribly difficult to include, but then again, it could have been intentionally omitted. And the brim of the hat should at least look a bit golden, perhaps similar to the Wave 2 C-3PO, with an egg emblem emblazoned front and center. I do really enjoy his facial expression though. Definitely one of the most faithful in the set. Angry Birds aren't supposed to be bald, are they? Or at least when it comes to Star Wars characters. But ironically, Mace Windu is the fluffiest of them all. For whatever reason, they decided that Windu deserved to get this coat of lush brown fur. We just talked about how Panaka's tones were too bright, but I think this normally long shiny cut helps capture the exact feather tone of Windu's render. If nothing else, it gives the plush a pretty unique look. That also makes him incredibly soft too, which doesn't hurt. Like other Jedis we've looked at, Commonwealth put great detail into his tunic, even printing a small buckle for his belt. As for the face, it's once again spot on. Windu, the Angry Bird anyways, is known for this stoic yet discontent look, and you just see that whenever you look at him. But for a bird who's a member of the Jedi High Council, I'd expect him to wield the signature purple blade, or at least the hilt. But that's this guy's one and only fault, it's a flawless plush otherwise. And come on, who doesn't enjoy seeing Samuel L. Jackson in plush form? If you haven't seen the legendary 2012 Video Game Awards skit, I can't help you. The final bird's eye character is not, oh, you know, any of the Padawans or Padme, no, it's Silver C-3PO. A character that doesn't actually appear in the main campaign of Star Wars 2, making him one of the only plushies in the set exclusively accessible through the telepods feature. Now, I see why they did this one. It's an easy opportunity to simply recolor C-3PO from Wave 2. He's another example of one they attempted twice, with the later version being objectively more accurate to the game, but stylistically I do like how they kept this area gold on the original, even if it's not entirely accurate. As a bonus entry, let's take a look at the Blue Squadron sample, who I'm grouping in with the rest of the Star Wars 2 plushies as I have no record as to when this guy was made. The copyright date indicates that it was licensed in 2012, so it's definitely an earlier one. But it also could have been set to release alongside Pilot Luke in Wave 2, as that set was released in mid-2013. and this sample appears to be finalized months before, if my theory is correct. When you picture what a Rebel pilot plush would look like, is this not the exact thing that comes to mind? Commonwealth cleverly reused Pilot Luke's helmet, but with the blue and orange color scheme they're known for. It's based on the updated design variant of blue, so we see those familiar cross eyes behind the yellow tinted visor and the two tail feathers poking out the back. In pointing that out, the art that Rovio actually provided for Commonwealth depicts him with 3, so it's a miracle they ignored that to make the perfect example of him. There was an earlier prototype made alongside others from the Star Wars 1 sets, but as we'll see with some of the Porkside characters, that doesn't necessarily mean these later samples should belong to that set. Speaking of, I believe it's time we shift factions and discuss the heavily marketed Porkside. Let's start with what's technically the first sample of them all, Greedo. He was originally intended to be part of the first batch of Star Wars plushies released in 2012, which makes sense considering his one and only appearance was in the cutscenes of the Tatooine episode. This particular sample dates back to around January 2013, but was later revised around March to match the updated renders. Yes, there are seemingly 2 different official renders for Greedo that look completely different from one another, which means that Commonwealth was making samples based off 2 designs they were sent. Considering they had to do this twice, I feel like they nailed both. The original is easy to identify because the eye vinyl was colored gray as a placeholder. Doesn't really matter what color anything is during this process because all you're looking for is to see whether the pattern itself matches the intended character. Though having the correct colors certainly doesn't hurt. This one relies more heavily upon embroidery, as you can see, with the snout, wrinkles, and distinguishing unibrow. The top of the plush is surprisingly well detailed, especially these air pockets that create that bumpy texture Greedo is known for. The only major inaccuracy here are his blades of hair, which were condensed into a mohawk-like structure. But again, that was a shortcoming on Rovio's behalf, not Commonwealth's. The second design thankfully received the correct colored eye vinyl and features a much slimmer nose that extends into the unibrow this time. The wrinkles were also more effectively integrated into the plush that added up to give the character much needed complexion. No mohawk on this one, certainly a plus, but the ears lost their horn-like shape and became much flatter. The improved embroidery is the only thing saving those. Both could potentially benefit from a bluish-green hue because I still don't think the color is quite right on either. Then again, Commonwealth really got the greens to perfectly match the pigs, so close enough I suppose. On the topic of insignificant characters, at least as it relates to Angry Birds, here's the Royal Guard pig. It's one of these characters that originates from Star Wars 1, but this time was only used in promotional material for the game. For as iconic as the Palpatine protectors are, they were surprisingly never featured in a single level. Now, they did later return as a part of the Carbonite pack for Star Wars 2, but again, that was a telepod exclusive. Like Greedo, the Guard was originally sampled as a part of the initial wave of Star Wars plushies, but eventually made its way into this third wave. The 2 designs we have here are objectively downgrades compared to that original sample, as that one got the fork, the embroidered eyebrows, and relies less on vinyl. Always a positive when you can dispense that material, though I'm okay with this use for the visors in all 3. So the first prototype for this set is closer to that one, but the textured vinyl is admittedly jarring. The crimson helmet is supposed to be a uniform color, unlike what we see here. I do appreciate the stitch felt at the base to create that signature silhouette they're known for. The second sample improved the appearance of the vinyl area that definitely enhanced the look of the plush, at the cost of more brittle material. Embroidery on the ears now match the dark red seen in the snout too, a small detail that any collector would appreciate. The stitched felt area now wrapped all the way around as well, notably adding a third flap in the back, but as you've probably noticed, they removed his signature fork. Let's go with a pig that actually does appear in Star Wars 1. The Snowtrooper pig is stapled from the 3rd episode of the game, Hoth. The general design doesn't deviate from the standard Stormtrooper too much, at least as it pertains to the materials they used. Though of course, the Snowtroopers have a unique suit to survive the frigid conditions of Hoth. Minimal use of prints on this one, just some black semicircles for the ears and some light gray crescents for the snout. The eyes use 2 pieces of vinyl stitched together to make them appear to bulge out. Though as you can see, time hasn't been too kind to this particular area. I do find it odd how this one lacks any sort of sewn-in label. It's the only one I have that doesn't. You can check under this flap, it's not there. Underside, not there either. Others I've seen do, but this one I guess was from a different run of samples or they just ran out of tags. Or some arbitrary third option. Your guess is as good as mine. Certainly the most unique plush in the set has to be Jabba the Hutt, simply due to the slug-like shape of the character, just as he's described in the character encyclopedia. The Sir Steve's Guide photo of Jabba was taken almost directly straight on, obscuring the sheer length of the plush. almost makes you wonder how he'd fit inside a standard-sized retail platform. Due to the unique dimensions of the plush, Commonwealth had trouble deciding how they should measure the character to fit within the 5-inch and 8-inch scales, diagonally as standard or lengthwise in this case. They ended up making 2 different samples to account for both methods, so there are 2 different 5-inch as well as 8-inch samples. The general design of the plush surprisingly relies on 3 important prints. 2 for the mustard yellow eyes and 1 for his enormous mouth, which cannot quite cover his upper set of teeth. Only embroidery details are for his cleft chin, yellow accented snout, and ears. This one came out perfect in my estimation. All the layers of fat and lumps really bring this one to life. What more can be said about Boba Fett, a fan favorite within the Star Wars 2 set for sure? Well, a lot actually. This birdie hunter fiend has the most comprehensive development of them all, so strap in as we discuss how this Bubba became to be. Introduced in the Cloud City update in 2013, Commonwealth was already a few months ahead of schedule, beginning initial sampling in late 2012. After about a week or 2, this was the result. The first variation of Boba Fett, who features a tall and rather slim dark green body. It's an early prototype, nothing had to be perfect at this point, but it was clear that the pattern needed some work, especially around back as his signature jetpack was completely missing. They tried creating this felt cutout that they printed and laminated to get an idea of how they wanted to scale with the plush. Then this one came along, which featured a completely 3-dimensional jetpack, an enhancement reserved for only this particular 8-inch. The central missile launcher, the fuel tanks, and even the exhaust are made completely plush. So you'd be right to assume this would remain in any future Bubba samples. But your intuition is wrong, because for the next round of samples, we revert back to this thin piece of printed fabric stitched firmly to the back of the plush. I get the sense they didn't feel it was necessary to sample it with the complete jetpack each time, and we're probably trying to find ways to simplify the pattern for production anyways. I take it that the missile was deemed a crucial part of the design, as that remained 3-dimensional for this one. But let's spin this guy around, because the jetpack facade is the least notable change for this prototype. Most will immediately notice the revised targeting rangefinder that cut the leftmost portion and was made thicker so it wouldn't droop downward like before. Here you can also see his ear was stitched much closer to it, but I'm unsure if this was intentional. Down below, you'll find that a separate piece of green fabric was added to cover his exposed green skin as an attempt to make the character appear more flat. These changes are all visually identifiable, as in you can see what was changed, but what you cannot see is the why. They didn't go through this process again because they felt like it. These were adjustments that Rovio specifically noted, yet I still wouldn't call this one the definitive variation. Most of its inaccuracies had not been addressed, though this was a step in the right direction. The significance of this plush isn't necessarily related to what it did for Boba Fett though. Earlier, when discussing the backstory of this set generally, there was one key moment I neglected to mention, because it involves this specific Bubba. On September 1st, 2013, Boba Fett himself posted a sneak peek of the plush on Twitter, a stock image presumably sourced from either Rovio or Commonwealth, which nobody saw. The particular one shown had the original ear replacement, so it's not the exact same plush I've shown today, but everything else appears to be the same. This was only a few weeks before the game launched too, so in theory, this was the ideal time to share for maximum engagement. Funnily enough, at that point, that bubble was probably a few months out of date because near the end of July, Commonwealth at last corrected most of the first design's issues, most notably the color. This set the table for the final sample created around early August. And what a beauty it is. The proportions were spot on this time, again something Rovio specifically noted was a problem with the original. Since the plush is basically just a beheaded helmet, it's important that every detail was captured authentically, and the main color will go a long way towards that. Forest green was out, this dark teal was in. That alone makes this one superior, but I also like what they did with the vinyl visor. It of course is supposed to be curved, and that was one of the main problems with the original, where they decided that it needed to be straight for some reason. This one addressed that issue, and even added some black vinyl below the snout to complete the look. They also added those 5 tally marks next to his bullet gash, a detail Rovio themselves added for Bubba's final design. But around back is where you find one of the most significant upgrades. They finally gave the 5-inch a proper jetpack. A minor downgrade from that one-off sample, but far superior compared to all the others we've looked at. The center section is completely plush and made from that same polyurethane material the helmet is made from. The 2 tanks and exhaust are still just prints, but at least they're 2 separate pieces that jut out from the sides. Easily one of the best in the set, which made sampling his father, Jango Fett, a much easier process. He is essentially just a recolor of Bubba, though that isn't to say he's 100% identical. They obviously changed the colors from red and green to blue and silver. That part wasn't an issue, as we saw with C-3PO. However, Jango is supposed to be larger than Bubba, and when comparing the two side by side, you can tell they made Jango less stumpy. One of the most obvious alterations can be seen at the top, because unlike Bubba's helmet, Jango had cutouts for his ears. Around back, as far as I can tell, the jetpacks are 99% identical. If anything, maybe the missile at the top is a little brighter on Jango. There is a minor Jango variation where the targeting rangefinder is colored completely silver, unlike the two-tone we see here, which I believe to be the earlier variant given this inaccuracy. Oh, and of course, he doesn't have the tallies or the bullet gash that Bubba does. For both of them, I would have liked to have seen an alternate version with their blasters, because again, that's their ability in the game. That, or just give them the complete jetpack they deserve. Don't settle for anything less. Darth Sidious, or as most Angry Birds fans call him, Emperor Palpatine, is without a doubt one of the most iconic Star Wars characters, being the literal head of the pork side. Now, what a lot of people don't remember about him is that he was actually debuted in Star Wars 2 before Star Wars 1, as the only episode he ever appeared in the first game was Death Star 2, the game's final content update in December 2013. Though the character was used in promotional materials far back as 2012, when Palpatine was finalized has nothing to do with the plush. Given that information, it's surprising to see that only one variation of the plush exists, and thankfully it's pretty damn good. This one makes use of zero prints, only some embroidery for his teeth, ears, wrinkled skin around his mouth, and his bulbous snout. Might I add that they attempted to give the nostrils some depth by off-centering the embroidery, but it really only works from one angle, and ends up looking quite flat. That overhanging snout also covers up his 3 teeth and devious grin. Palpatine's signature expression, of course. His cloak shrouds most of his body, including his eyes, to the point where they didn't even bother with any detail underneath. Since the cloak is sewn tight to the body, you'd never see the eyes anyways unless you wanted to damage the plush. Always found it amusing how Palpatine retained King Pig's enormous crown and kept it obscured at all times. Though to this point, some might be surprised to learn that it's not even a crown at all. According to the character encyclopedia, it's actually a fork. Indeed, a utensil, not a jewel. Now on the plush, it's just a flat rectangular piece that holds the crown-shaped area of the cloak up, so you won't find any evidence to back up what the book says. He's another character where I feel the standard pig green doesn't exactly fit though. Palpatine has pale green skin in almost all existing media, unless we're saying this is Chancellor Palpatine. But even then, this green hue just doesn't fit. For a more visually interesting character, we turn to Darth Maul, where the excessive use of vinyl starts to rear its ugly head. Almost all tattooed areas on the front side of the plush were achieved using a thin layer of black vinyl, but you cannot argue with the result, it simply looks amazing. The only other way they could have achieved this effect would be to color the red fur in those areas black, but I'd imagine that'd be pretty difficult to manufacture logistically. Embroidery could do the trick, but it just wouldn't look as clean in my opinion. For the later variation, they tried to use embroidery for just the eyes, which to me is a good compromise. I'd be curious to see how embroidered ears and snout would look on this one too. You can see underneath the snout that Maul has a set of 4 teeth, similar to those featured on the Go Helmet Pig. Maul's teeth are one of his defining characteristics, along with the Dathomir horns up top to give him that satanic look. So happy to see they weren't an afterthought. The backside of the plush is largely devoid of details, but most of the space is taken up by his Sith robes. The first variant is mostly gray with a huge collar wrapping around the backside, while the later variant is a much darker gray with a subdued collar and minor printing differences. Tilt them on their sides and you'll find that the underside was clothed up for the later sample, leaving the original with a rather naked look in comparison. Maul's signature dual lightsaber would have been the cherry on top, but as we know, outside the electronic samples, Commonwealth never included extended blades with plushies. The penultimate plush of today's showcase is none other than General Grievous, who despite being prominently featured on Star Wars 2's startup screen, only featured in the first 3 levels of Revenge of the Pork. But given how iconic the cyborg warrior is to the Star Wars cognoscenti, come on, he had to get himself a plush. Ah yes, the negotiator indeed. The plush itself has an excellent pattern, but the colors are just completely wrong, pretty much everywhere. This felt section was made brown for some reason, a color they also used for the ear embroidery, eyebrows, and snout accent. This lavender color for these plates, forehead embroidery, and mouth area is one that's unique to the plush, but I don't see why they didn't just use gray, unless this was a placeholder color. The main body itself should be a bone white as well, and it's best demonstrated when you put the render and the plush side by side. The only part that really looks accurate to me are his reptile eyes, which have that venomous look, especially when highlighted by the red embroidery. The plush on its own looks fantastic, it's just when you compare it to any official render of the character, it falls flat. And this was one that desperately needed the 4 lightsaber hilts. That's his whole shtick. What I don't see discussed nearly enough as it should are the characters that were missing from Toy Fair. We can talk about Padme Amidala or Count Dooku, but the fact that Anakin Skywalker, the main character of the prequels, arguably the most iconic character in Star Wars 2, didn't receive a plush at all? As we now know, we were slated to see the pod racer Anakin, but what about Padawan and Sith Apprentice? Padawan has its own complicated story, but here's Sith Apprentice, sampled only in 8-inch like the Blue Squadron, and what a sight to behold. The fact we were not only robbed of the whole set, but duly so because of this guy, along with all the other variants, it's the definition of a tragedy, and they never would have seen the light of day unless I had intervened. Insane that statement's even coming out of my mouth. This one shares quite a bit with his younger counterpart, even down to when they were sampled. These two come from the exact same run, May 8th, 2013. Closest you'll ever find to Plush twins, funnily enough. On the downside though, that also means he got stuck with some paper details, but at least this time the Plush didn't heavily rely on them. In fact, the only part that had paper details was his lightsaber hilt, an element shared with, oh I don't know, 6 other Star Wars plushies? That is definitely amongst the strangest things I've seen. So sadly, I couldn't quite save him in time, but it's such a small part of the plush, and hardly takes away from the overall aesthetic. His robes perfectly replicate those seen in the game, my favorite detail being how the rim of his outer robe appears to pass through under the belt and dangle near the base. And right next to that transition, you see the black undershirt and stitched belt buckle, 2 separate pieces of elbow and felt attached to the front. The embroidered belt wraps around the whole plush with a pocket to his right side and gold energy capsules to the left. The face exudes a more calm disposition as opposed to the angry one generally associated with the character, which I'm okay with here. We almost never saw this particular look on Anakin in any media, but early renditions of the character more closely resemble what we see here. More specifically, the early non-Toon style variant, which these Anakins are based off. The eyes are nearly identical to Little Annie's, but the signature dark brown unibrow at last makes its appearance, as well as the iconic embroidered scar. The one thing I'll let you quibble with is the way his hair looks. Perhaps a bit too simplistic from the front angle, but at the sides and the back it looks far better to me. This guy is personally my favorite plush in the entire set, not only because of his significance to Star Wars 2 as a whole, but because it's one of the forbidden fruits of Angry Bird plush lore. Surreal to have my hands on it alongside the rest. For those counting at home, we've covered 34 plushies, but I mentioned I have 39, so what gives? You might assume I'm gonna pull out 5 never before seen plushies and blow your socks off. And you'd be right. Kinda. These 5 are not the conventional 5-inch or 8-inch plushies we're accustomed to. Rather, they are 4-inch, a size variation often reserved for multi-packs. And that's the situation here. These are the first ever Star Wars 2 samples, originally done with paper details as far back as December 3rd, 2012. These are not those exact samples, but were likely created the next round, and were based on the earliest renditions of the designs. Now, you're probably wondering what a multi-pack including these 5 would look like. That assumes they'd all be bundled together, but in fact they were supposed to be bundled in 2 collectible 3-packs, each including 3 different variants of Anakin and Obi-Wan respectively. For Anakin, we would see a mini for each prequel film, episodes 1, 2, and 3, necessitating a Padawan variant. For Obi-Wan, we would have both Padawan and Jedi variants in the prequels, and then the conventional trilogy design thrown in. Think of them like coming-of-age packs, though as you can see, the box was never materialized, though don't rule out the possibility that I can correct that issue. I'll leave it at that. Anyways, obviously the bigger absence here is the episode 1 Anakin, who is indeed lost to time. But I do have a picture of what he did look like, and I will update should he ever be found. Interestingly, he's not based on the pod racer render of the character. Would be curious to see if that was intentionally omitted, or if Rovio's original intention was to feature him without his helmet. Overall, the characters are of a higher quality than other 4-inch plushies, but were designed to use less materials than a typical 5-inch or 8-inch. This is especially apparent when looking at the tunics, which are flush with the body on every single one. But they still got lightsaber hilts, quality embroidery, and the Padawans still got their traditional braids. Feels like a set they could have released independent of the rest, given these are the main characters of the prequels. As established with the 4-inch young Anakin, I am not in possession of every single Star Wars sample made for this additional wave. So what exactly is unaccounted for? Recall that July Boba Fett? As you could probably tell based on how I didn't actually show the actual item, I don't have it. I have no idea where these are, and as you might guess, there are others who are missing. In order to contextualize, I'll have to explain the initial plan for this massive third wave. In fact, around March 2013, this set more closely resembled your typical 6 to 8 character assortment. There's an obvious bias towards characters from Star Wars 1, made sense given the timing, but we still see Maul and Windu, so yes, more characters are likely on the way. It's interesting to point out that R2 was reallocated to this set, being dropped from Wave 2 that went into production the following month. This, at the very least, shows an intention to finally release him, but the assortment just never transpired, which means if he was going to hit production, he'd have to be added to later production runs of Wave 2, which also never happened. He'll always be a Wave 2 in spirit though, despite what you see here. We're talking about incomplete archives though, so let's shift our focus to this Ewok, Windu, the Hog Guard, and Jabba. I describe the Ewok as a hybrid between the two we looked at, retaining some elements from the first sample such as the stitching prints, but receiving the overall look of the second. This early Windu is practically identical to the final, but we see this one must have referenced the angrier expression. Fellow Plush collector What a Gamer actually acquired a matte fur variant of the final design, so to be clear, there are actually 3 different designs for the character. It was formerly owned by Tony Cassenius, a lead artist at Rovio, so you can come to a reasonable conclusion as to how he got it. Thankful that it will remain in trusted hands. Anyways, Hog Guard. Again, everything here is the same as the final, but this one got the fork, and on the front side too. Then you got your Jabba with paper details, as if the final one wasn't enough nightmare fuel. I'd be interested to see how that one would look today, given that the paper details would likely have withered away by now, like on the Anakin duo. If we were stuck with just this front angle, we'd probably assume he's practically identical to the final, but thankfully we have the luxury of looking at him from any angle, and you can immediately tell that this sample's backside is much smoother. Still working on those rolls of fat, I see. And so that's it. I'd say I'm doing pretty well for myself considering I'm only down 9, at least as far as I know. Technically, that number should be 15 if we consider the paper detailed 4-inch minis, but I can live with that. Now you have all the answers to the test. More knowledge of this unreleased wave than you have any right to. But the most important question is the one I've left unanswered. Why did they not go into production? It's a simple question seeking an unconditioned answer. You want there to be a one-size-fits-all here, and you want that size to have as few stipulations as possible. Well, my brother in Christ, that's not how these things work. There are numerous factors that rained on this parade, so allow me to elaborate. I'll do my best to highlight what I feel is important. Come 2014, Angry Birds merchandise as a whole was on the decline. We all know this. Consumers were on to the next, and a niche line like this just wasn't necessary given those market conditions. Contrary to popular belief, Waves 1 and 2 were not as big of a hit as you'd expect, given the magnitude of the 2 IPs at play. Even so, a casual looking to purchase an Angry Bird plush would prefer just to buy a Wave 1 of either classic or Star Wars than some obscure prequel character. And they're certainly not going to buy 20 of them. Even diehard collectors like you wouldn't have done that either. It was too much at the wrong time. Angry Birds, Star Wars, and products involving both were already well represented in the marketplace, but even that reached its peak. It would result in diminishing returns had anything further been introduced. But perhaps the bigger factor involved was the dual licensing itself. Not only would Commonwealth have to pay Rovio for the rights to use the Angry Birds brand, but they'd also have to pay Lucasfilms for Star Wars. Say they were paying 10% to Rovio, and Star Wars was undoubtedly more, right? Maybe 15 or 20%? And at that point, is it even worth the trouble? Now, I'd argue that a smaller assortment similar to that March snapshot we analyzed could have filled the void, but you'd have to produce the correct characters, ones that were slam dunks, going to be a hit. We're talking Boba Fett, Palpatine, Darth Maul, but that's not enough to justify a wave, nor does it account for all the characters which we the enthusiasts would have wanted anyways. Our argument would have been, if you're gonna make some characters, why not them all? We'd still be having this conversation about all these unreleased plushies. To be fair, that was Star Wars 2's selling point. The characters. It was about them. Ironically, after all the effort put into the plushies themselves, the only aspect of the set Commonwealth would ever use for production was their tags. As mentioned earlier, the Star Wars Waves 1 and 2 plushies available through the Tesco promotion in 2015 reused the infamous Wave 3 art, serving as a cruel reminder of what we missed out on. Now, I tend to assume most of you in the weeds like me would generally be aware of this, but what I've never seen anybody bring up, or more precisely explain, is this photo. This display showed up at Costco wholesalers of all places in November 2013, and featured some 12-inch run-of-the-mill Star Wars plushies. Though more notably, they donned the at the time in development updated Star Wars tags. This means that displays and tags are out there, but obviously these are extremely uncommon. So there you have it, a comprehensive overview of the Angry Birds Star Wars 2 set. Never thought I'd say that. Though I want people to recognize it as Star Wars Wave 3 because that's how it was referred to internally. A shame such a fantastic wave was relegated to Toy Fair and never seen again, but thankfully most have not wound up as physically lost media. Just know that an example of each piece will be properly preserved, so long as I supervise their existence. These would have been the perfect companion piece to the Angry Birds Star Wars duology, iconic games that fans hold in high regard, even to this day. Hopefully this video can fill the void. If you have any comments, questions, or complaints, you can let me know in the comment section below. With that I say, peace out.